When I'm looking through my email, I usually see one of three things. Number one is personal RPG horror story requests. Number two is people wanting me to look over their backstories. And number three, sometimes people wanting me to look over their homebrew. Now, why anyone thinks I'm qualified to do any of these things is beyond me, but today I'm going to address the last one because I do think homebrew is a very interesting part of Dungeons & Dragons and something that a lot of DMs are justifiably sometimes afraid of. It makes sense. Homebrew can be intimidating. So today, let's endeavor to make it a little bit less such. I'm going to be talking about how to handle homebrew in your D&D game. Alright, so elephant in the room, when people are asking me to look over homebrew, they're not usually asking me to look over homebrew stories. In fact, they never ask me to look over homebrew stories, they ask me to look over homebrew mechanics. This is what usually scares people, not stories that they develop for their own campaigns, rather mechanics for classes or monsters. And I think that this is justifiable. A lot of people can write their own stories. A lot of DMs are people who have at least attempted to pen a book. However, people who are DMs are not always game designers. And I don't think you need to be a game designer to make homebrew. Now, I think there are plenty of guides out there on how to create homebrew that are way better than anything I could ever come up with because I know very little about creating my own classes or monsters. However, I do know a little something about implementation because I've been running a homebrew campaign with a lot of homebrew elements for a while. So let's talk about that first. Implementation. How do you know when and what to put into your game that is outside of the official material? This is always my rule when I go onto Unearthed Arcana to look for homebrew. When I go onto Unearthed Arcana, the reason I do it is because I need something to fill some sort of fantasy. It's always for a thematic purpose. I think there's a mistake that a lot of DMs make, which is I need to look for homebrew in order to change things up. I want to do it to fulfill some quota. And I think that is a major disservice to yourself because homebrew is, quite frankly, at least in my opinion, very difficult to set up. It is harder to do than the stuff in the books. In Dungeons & Dragons, the books give you very explicit guides on what to do mechanically for all of their stuff. Homebrew, some authors of homebrew do that, some don't. And frankly, looking through the thousands and thousands of homebrew options out there is much harder than looking through a couple hundred pages in a Dungeons & Dragons book. So yes, homebrew is time-consuming to use, and I don't think you always need to use it. When I use it, it's to fulfill a specific need. I'm looking for something. I don't just want something new. I want something specific that the books are not giving me, that exists beyond just reskinning and flair. Now, there are plenty of great sources of homebrew that can facilitate this, but always have a purpose for the homebrew before you get to implementation, and when you're just looking for something to add, have a specific goal for what you want. If you don't have a specific goal, find one. Narrow down what you want for the next session in order to look for the specific monster or the specific NPC or quest or situation that you want. Alright, so you've found your homebrew. Now you need to figure out if it fits into the game. Is it balanced? Yes, that's a dreaded thing. Balance. The game aspect of Dungeons & Dragons can be really hard for non-game designers to gauge sometimes, but Dungeons & Dragons was made to be accessible, and there are a lot of tools you can use in order to gauge if a monster or a mechanic is too powerful. Number one, average damage. Now, I've already talked about challenge rating in my last Q&A, and I also talked a little bit about average damage. But often, when I'm looking at a magical item or a monster that I'm about to throw at the players, I look at how much damage it can do on average. A simple calculation, and one that's often just included into the stat block. Beyond that, I can also just take out a dice roller and roll out the damage a couple times. How much damage can this monster do against the party? How much damage can this item I'm giving the party do against a monster? Is it insane damage that will one-shot a player? Is it an area of an effect attack that will reduce everything in the vicinity to half health? How powerful is this, and am I okay with that level of power? Have a little bit of foresight. I know that that's really, really vague, but think through a bunch of scenarios that could possibly happen. If this monster can outright one-shot a player with a crit, you need to think to yourself, do I want that to happen? If you want that to happen, great. Do you want this to be a really brutal encounter for a higher level party? Now, if this is not something that you want, I do recommend that you change it down just a little bit. However, I have spoken multiple times about how DMs should scale up monsters rather than scaling them down, especially boss monsters. Now, if you're just doing run-of-the-mill adversaries, then yeah, don't scale them up. A lot of people have pointed this out. I don't make goblins or zombies gleefully overpowered just to nerf them down mid-session. I usually do this for bosses. I make bosses really powerful, and if they're too powerful, I take them down a notch, but not so many notches that they're no longer threatening. I usually gauge it right though because of that technique with average damage. I know how much damage this creature can do in one turn. I know what it can do to the party, therefore I usually don't need to make adjustments. However, if I had to make adjustments, I'd rather adjust a monster downwards rather than upwards. Okay, so we've got monsters, we've got items, we've talked about damage. That's usually what I hear when people are asking me about homebrew and if it fits. And that's usually what I see when a homebrew is going wrong. Too much damage from the players or from the monsters. But what about mechanics? New resurrection mechanics, new curse mechanics. This is something I also implement into my games. And the number one rule I talk about with implementing new mechanics is not to make it too complicated on your players. Now, of course, every table is run differently. Some tables love complicated mechanics, more complex encounters. As always, D&D is different depending on who you're talking to. And as always, I recommend that you gauge what your table likes and doesn't like about complex mechanics, if they like them at all. However, with that being said, I think the majority of tables don't want overly convoluted mechanics. In one episode of RPG Horror Stories, in my pre-show bit, I was mocking an overly convoluted skill proficiency system, and that is the epitome of what I'm talking about here. Make it only as complicated as it needs to be. Stuff like resurrections, to me, resurrection's a very powerful thing, therefore it should be a little bit hard to pull off. Same thing with curses. I like curses being devastating but rare at the same time, meaning that the mechanics for removing them is more than just cast spell and be done. There's a little bit of a ritual involved, skill checks, stuff like that. But nothing so convoluted that completely confuses the party. Mechanics, monsters, weapons, we've covered those. Now it's time for classes. Now classes to me are the hardest because I have never fully created a homebrew class or a homebrew subclass. That's outside of my range. I might do it someday, and I have dabbled a little bit, but I haven't fully immersed myself in creating my own homebrew class yet. However, I do have recommendations for implementation of a class, and my number one recommendation is this. Focus on the theme. Your D&D class is one of the most, if not the most, thematic element of a D&D character. It is really, really important, and often that theme really builds a character. It's the foundation for who they are a lot of the time. So, I think that when you're looking through homebrew classes, that should be the focus, not necessarily mechanics. Now, I know what you're thinking. I literally just told an RPG horror story in my Q&A about a DM that didn't look through class balance and suffered for it. I think that you're right. Yes, I did talk about that, and I still stand by that point. It is important to pay attention to balance, but at the same time, make sure that you also prioritize the theme of the class. Don't just get rid of it because you think it is unbalanced. Work with the player to balance it out. And I have mentioned this before, I think it is okay for DMs to rebalance things, either buffs or nerfs, to something in the middle of the game. The DM can't predict the future, nor can the players. It is impossible to know what will be balanced or unbalanced 100% of the time. Hell, sometimes the things in the player's handbook are going to be unbalanced, so Homebrew is going to be the exact same way. So I think balancing during the game is okay, but make sure not to take away the theme of the class. That's always what I pay attention to first, even before balancing, even if I think balancing is also very much important. Alright, I think that will cover it for today. If you are wondering about my thoughts on Homebrew stories, check out my Brandon Sanderson 3 Laws of World Building video where I talk about homebrewing your own worlds. I think that covers a lot of my thoughts on making your own homebrew world and the process of it. I might make more videos about this in the future because homebrew is one of those things that I'm very, very much passionate about. I love homebrew, and I think will always have a place in my D&D games. But anyway, if you want to see more episodes of this series, then please do hit subscribe. If you want to let me know that you enjoyed this video in particular, then please hit that like button. And finally, if you want to leave your own tips and thoughts, go down to the comments down below. In essence, like, comment, subscribe. I kind of messed up the outro here, but whatever. I will see you all next time. Farewell.